Welcome to another episode of London Lights, the show where we talk about notable Londoners who have made a big impact on the world scene, primarily in this season, talking about the world of entertainment. And tonight, or today, I have as my guest, Doug Moore, and we're going to talk about the band Lighthouse. Now, Lighthouse is a Canadian band formed in 1968 in Toronto, Ontario. Their sound included horns, string instruments, vibraphone, and rock music. And their music reflected elements of rock, jazz, classical, and even swing. They won Juno Awards for the Best Canadian Group of the Year in 1972, 1973, and 1974. Although they skipped the opportunity to play at that great festival, Woodstock, they did play at the Isle of Wight and played with some of the biggest acts in music at the time, even Jimi Hendrix, The Who, and Jethro Tull. They had a number of gold and platinum records, huge hits, but they stopped touring in 1974, only to reform about 18 years later to go on tour. Skip Prokop formed the band with Paul Hoffert, and they spent many years, Skip spent many years here in London, Ontario, and has some very strong connections to London. My guest today is Doug Moore. He's a London area musician, described as one of the hardest working men in music. And he joined that reformed Lighthouse with Skip Prokop, and they toured, and he'll tell us about that today. Doug, welcome to the show. Good to see you.
Hi, Dan.
Doug, I wanted to start the show by telling you about my love for music in the 1960s. And you probably had a similar love. There was so much openness to different musical styles back then. You had your hardcore garage bands, the quartets, the CCRs, the Who, the Kinks, Cream, Led Zeppelin. But then you also had the acoustic music that you'd hear alongside these hard rockers on the radio. You had the singing groups, the Association, Mamas and Papas, the Fifth Dimension. And then in 1968 and 69, we had some very talented rock musicians who wanted to explore this idea of marrying jazz music or classical music, strings and horns, with the hardcore rock sound. And out of that idea came some of the greatest bands that we've ever experienced in the 1960s and 70s. Chicago Transit Authority, who became Chicago, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and Canada's own Lighthouse. What can you tell me about Lighthouse and how they came to be?
Well, I remember when Lighthouse was big in Canada, and whenever they came to London, like, you had to go see them because it was so unusual. Now, what Skip has told me, like, he was in a group called the Poppers in the 60s in Toronto, the first Canadian band ever to have an American record deal, and that some of that eventually went sideways, but they opened for Cream. You wouldn't believe who they played with. They opened for Hendrix in Toronto.
Wow.
And they were managed by Albert Grossman, the famous Bob Dylan's manager. They were big time, but things went off the rails for them. And I believe Skip had been playing with Janis Joplin as well, plus other big names. I used to sit with room with Skip, and he'd just throw these names out, and I couldn't believe it. But anyway, he met Paul Hoffert in New York, I believe at the last Poppers gig they were ever going to play. Okay. And by a strange coincidence, they were flying back to Toronto the next day and sitting beside each other.
Oh, wow.
And that's where the idea hatched. Skip always wanted to do a band that could sound like the record. And Paul, with his sort of jazz, he was a jazz pianist, and they both liked that idea, but had no idea really how to do it, because Skip wanted strings. Like, he was an amazing guy, strings and horns, so Paul had the connections in Toronto with all the horn players and string play, those kind of things. So they got together at Paul's house and put up a plan, and the next problem was, how do you mic violins and cellos? And that was the big, and I believe they kind of figured out how to put pickups on these instruments, and away they went. somehow.
Can you tell me what kind of drummer was Skip? I heard he was very in demand. He was one of the top drummers known on the continent, played with some of the greatest acts. How did you find him as a musician?
He was legendary as a drummer. Like he started in Hamilton in drum corps as a kid, like these military, and this is what made him so unbelievable. Like in that psychedelic group, the Poppers I mentioned, people could not get over the drumming, like the rudiments, and the nobody played like that. And that's what sort of shot him in the spotlight. And he played with it's unbelievable who he has played with. Now he played with a group called Super Session, which was Al Cooper that started Blood, Sweat and Tears, and Mike Bloomfield.
Right.
And we always joke that Skip started at the top, sort of made his way down over the years. He played with Cass Elliot, you wouldn't believe it, Janis Joplin. But I even today, there's drummers in London that Skip was the guy.
Right.
And he was famous. Like when we'd go see Lighthouse, it was always Skip, Paul, and Ralph were the guys we always knew, and Bob, the singer.
The core of the band.
But Skip was like one phenomenal drummer.
It's funny you mentioned these coincidences. Here's Skip coming back from New York, and he's got this core of an idea. He doesn't know what to do with it. And just by circumstance, he ends up sitting beside Paul Hoffert. And this dream of an idea develops and becomes Lighthouse. And you hear about these coincidences so many other times. I just heard on the radio about Elton John trying out for a record contract, and he goes in, he meets the agent, and the guy says, "Nah, you can't cut it. But look, I'll give you some lyrics to work with." And he has 100 submissions of lyrics on his on the table. He hands an envelope just out of happenstance to Elton John, and it happens to be lyrics from Bernie Taupin. And of course, it creates this great songwriting duo between Elton John and Bernie Taupin.
I know.
Sometimes you wonder, these circumstances, are they just meant to be, or they just happen? But some
I remember
things.
I remember Skip telling me there was a guy opening for Lighthouse. It might have been in Toronto, playing all by himself. And they heard him and went, "Who is this guy's phenomenal?" And it was Elton John before he was famous.
Wow. So here we have Skip now. He's coming up with this idea. He's working with Paul Hoffert. He's got to put a band together, and he's got this incredible idea of marrying jazz and classical and rock. Does he get a record deal? How did things progress from there?
They got a record deal, and Albert Grossman didn't want to manage them, but he had another fellow that managed them. And they put out, I should have written down the album titles. They were really kind of jazzy, and there was no big hits that I'm aware of. And they just toured constant, like 300 days a year.
Wow.
It was like Paul Hoffert recently found a list of dates they had done in Canada, and it was unbelievable. It was like 30 nights in a row, day off, and then another 40.
Wow.
Like that.
Well, I know Skip was one of the hardest working musicians in rock at the time, and they got this deal with RCA in New York, and they do the first album, and they're kind of spinning their wheels because nothing's really connecting with the people in terms of radio play and that kind of thing. So then some things combine to take Lighthouse to the very next level, the higher echelon of rock. We're going to talk about that in a moment, but first we're going to take a commercial break, and then I'll be right back with Doug Moore, who played with Lighthouse. We're back now with Doug Moore of Lighthouse. We're talking about one of the greatest Canadian bands of all time, a super band. They won top band at the Junos for 3 years in a row, 1972, 73, and 74. But we're just talking about a combination of factors, Doug, that launched this band into superstardom. And that was the coincidence of events when Bob McBride, one of the greatest rock vocalists anywhere, joins the band in about 1971. And they record a new album because the first album's kind of faltering. And now they're joining together, joining forces, and they record a song called One Fine Morning. What can you tell me about that?
It was, I believe, one of the road crew guys for Lighthouse or business who, when they had a guy named Pinky Dobbin was the singer for Lighthouse, but I think they felt they needed to go someplace else. And he suggested this friend of his, Bob McBride. And as Skip used to say, Bob loved to sing like Johnny Mathis. Even when I knew Bob, he would imitate Johnny Mathis. But they realized he had like this incredible voice and pushed him to be the guy he was. And after that, things took, that was a big album, that's One Fine Morning. And the live at Carnegie Hall was really the biggest seller, platinum album.
And that One Fine Morning got them into the US market, correct?
I believe it was top 10. Yeah, even Santana covered that about 8 years ago again.
Wow. Oh,
yeah.
That's awesome.
And people, when we play, people in the States know that song.
Yeah, that's super. So one of the problems that Canadian musicians had in about 1970 was that there'd be these very talented guys in Canada and women who were playing terrific music, but there was this stigma against Canadian talent, and the radios just would not play Canadian bands. I mean, the Guess Who were the one exception. Of course, they hit it really big, but Skip recognized that problem, didn't he?
Yeah, and Lighthouse was doing okay, but they had done things in the States, like they recorded in the States. And so he somehow, because they were, I think they, like you said, they won the first 3 Junos, and I think they were called the RPM Awards in the late 60s. He got invited to Ottawa to testify before this committee deciding how to get Canadians on the radio. And Skip testified and said, we have to have something, or because Canadians cannot overcome the US infiltration of the Canadian radio stations.
Right. So they came up, from what I understand, I think you had a picture of Skip with Pierre Trudeau, the prime minister at the time. And he appeared before this committee, and he argued quite passionately, from what I understand, that radio stations in Canada be required to have 25% Canadian content on their record lists. And that became law in Canada and was instrumental in launching so many great Canadian musicians and artists and bands. Is that your understanding?
Yes, it is. And just a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, on the Junos, Pierre Juno, who they named the Junos after, made a speech. And I was just happened to be watching it, and he said, if it wasn't for people like Skip Prokop, the Canadian music scene would be nowhere.
Skip was a great musician, of course, but he was a real go-getter in other ways. He was passionate about things, and he recognized this problem with Canadian talent not being played on the radio. So he made his way to Ottawa and made things happen. He made these changes. He was instrumental in that. Did you find him to be like that when you worked with him?
Unbelievably, when he made his mind up, we used to make a joke. It must be nice to never second guess yourself. In the band was like, he just went where, when he made his mind up, that's where he was going. And it sometimes was detrimental, because he was a funny guy. Like, that way he was right, and this is the way it was going to be.
Yeah.
And on the other side of him, I think Paul Havert once said he'd give you the shirt off his back. But there was this other guy that he was right. It's his way. This is the way we're doing it.
Right.
It's for a guy like me. It's like I'm the antithesis of that. I just would watch him and go, holy cow.
Well, one of the things I like about so many different bands that really hit the big time is when they have more than one lead singer. And of course, Bob McBride was one of the great vocalists of our generation. He was the vocalist for Lighthouse, the main vocalist.
Yeah.
But it was kind of fun that every once in a while, Skip would sing a song as well. And one of those songs, of course, is Sunny Days, which you hear over and over on the radio, but you never get tired of that song. It just puts a smile on your face and a little skip in your step. And it's one of the ultimate great summer songs.
Yeah. And Skip used to say to me, isn't it funny that little song did so, like this sort of little throw off little tune did so well?
Well, tell me about the history of the song Sunny Days.
Now, I think Bob left the band suddenly, but don't quote me on that. And Jimmy Einer was their producer. Now, Jimmy Einer went on, he produced Eric Carmen, big time. I can't think of the movie. But anyway, and Jimmy goes, I hear no hits on here. Skip, write something. And Skip was planning on going on vacation. I believe they were in New York. So he flew back to Toronto. It was the hottest day of the year. And he said, stop, we can't go. And I believe he got a beer and went out and sat in his children's pool, the little metal pool, and sat there drinking a beer. And that's where you get sitting stoned alone in my backyard. And suddenly he said, just sort of came up with the little idea, Sunny Days, and went back and didn't think much of it and played it for Jimmy Einer, who went, that's a hit record.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he used to laugh listening to that story.
Just one of those coincidences again that happens when the stars all align in this tremendous hit record.
Yeah, he was like unstoppable. Like we wrote a lot together. And man, he'd drive around with a pad, like driving around London, think of lyrics, like writing them out. And he'd show up at my house and he'd sort of have all the lyrics done.
Can you think of any London landmark as you're driving around and Skip sees it and goes, I'm going to write a song about that?
Gosh, I don't know. It was when Lighthouse reformed. Like I played with Skip long before that. And was it 1991, I think Lighthouse reformed, and that's when I joined. And one day at a rehearsal, Paul Hoffert said, maybe we should do a CD. And Skip just looked at me and said, I'll be at your place 8 a.m. Saturday morning.
And you start writing songs.
Started writing most of the album.
Wow. So why did the band kind of go on hiatus for so many years? They hit 1974. They've been touring 300 days a year, as you say. Did they just burn out? Did Skip burn out? What happened?
I think so. They were played at the CNE, I believe, and Skip had just had it. He was too tired. And he said, had they had someone to talk to him, like a manager or something, that they should have said to him, why don't you take 6 months off and rethink this? But Skip, like what we discussed, I'm going to do it on my own. I'm going to be a solo guy, like off he goes. Okay. But he told me later he should have just taken a break.
Right.
But they really constantly toured.
Yeah. That'll burn you out. The band talked about that in the last waltz. The road can really be difficult.
Yeah.
So Skip tries this solo career, which really falters, doesn't really go anywhere. Lighthouse appears to be destined for the ash bin of history in music, but then something happens and the band reforms and they're back in the limelight. What was that, and how were you involved in that?
Well, through an odd coincidence, or not a coincidence, I was playing with Gene McClellan, a guy that wrote Snowbird and Put Your Hand in the Hand, and Gene was doing a TV show in I think it was Pembroke, a 13-week series. And Gene and I became friends. And he said to me, I'm doing an album at Attica State Prison in New York. And Skip Prokop is producing it. And I went, Skip Prokop from Lighthouse? And he went, yes, it's a whole other band out of Toronto. And I was at Gene's place and the phone rang and it was Skip, who the guitar player had quit the band that was doing the live album. And I could hear Gene, who was so laid back. Hey, man, yeah, I got a guy here, man. yeah, I think he'd be all right, man. Like that's how we talk. Like, yeah, sure. So the next thing I know, go to a Master's Workshop, big recording studio in Toronto on Monday, and join the other band. And
Okay.
so I knew all of Gene's material, and I showed up and I met, I was kind of excited. Skip Prokop was like one of the guy, and he right away loved my guitar playing. Skip and I played for years after that, and I can't quite remember this, but G- Skip ended up coming up and doing the TV show playing drums, and of
Oh,
course took over the band, which annoyed the guy that had put the band together, but it made it way better. And after that, I played with Skip on the Attica State Prison album. Then any project Skip had, the Mackenzie Procop band,
mm.
and then Bob McBride. We started playing with Bob and did sessions I think you know about. And then one day, Skip called me and said, Lighthouse is getting better. Lighthouse is getting back together, man. You can play bass, can't you? And I went, gosh, I don't know. And he said, sure you can. And that was it. I went and rented a bass at Long and McQuaid, or John Malone's, I think. I went, rented a bass and tried to learn how to play the Lighthouse tunes.
Well, I've heard some of your work from those sessions, and the aiming for the heart sessions, I think they were called, or something like that.
Empty Heart. Yeah.
For some charity work for World Vision that you guys did, and some superb bass playing on there, Doug, I must say.
Well, that was it seems like a long time ago now, but I played mostly guitar on all of that stuff. And now I just, Skip was so easy to play with
Yeah.
as a drummer. So it made my bass playing easier than it could have been, for sure.
All right. So now Lighthouse is reformed. Skip, who was born in Hamilton, has now made London his home at that point, correct?
Just shortly thereafter, he moved to Belmont and then to London. No, it was actually, he was here when Lighthouse reformed.
Okay.
Yeah, I think he was living in Belmont.
And he was also working for a local radio station, wasn't he?
Then he worked at BX93 for years as a sales, like a freelance kind of sales wheel. He was very friendly, and he liked that job.
So, of course, Bob McBride and Skip are the kind of the heart of the band. How do things go with Bob? I understand he had some personal troubles.
He did. He even when Lighthouse did the One Fine Weekend, what was that, in the 80s, they played Ontario, they reformed to play Ontario Place. I forget how many thousand people came out to see them. And Bob was great, but he had, over the years, had developed some heroin problems, some drug problems, was hard on his body. But when Lighthouse reformed again, Bob was the singer. He was great. And then he started to slip. And Skip used to say to me, if heroin was legal, Bob would be fine. It was him trying to stop. And he began to be, it's almost like he wore himself out. He had no energy. And we did a little tour up north, and we played north of Toronto, and it was unbelievable. He was falling asleep on stage.
Oh, wow.
Ralph Cole said, we can't play anymore with Bob.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Hey, we have to wrap up. We're getting
Okay.
close to the end here. But Skip, of course, was in London. Then he went to Elmer in his last days. And unfortunately, he's no longer with us. Did he die a happy man? I think it was 3 years or so ago. And what is the legacy of Lighthouse?
The legacy of Lighthouse, like, I don't know how happy Skip was, like he couldn't play anymore, but his son took over for him, and that made him very happy, that because that was Skip, it was kind of Skip's band, Skip and Paul's band, and that Jamie taking over for him sort of eased the pain. He even came out to see us once, I remember. The legacy of the band is, it is amazing when we play all across the country, the number of people that come out to see us afterwards, and how their memory of Lighthouse at their high school, their hockey rink, they played everywhere. And we've done some of these rock cruises like with Procol Harum, and we've done lots of those. And Americans come on the cruise ship because they see that it's Lighthouse, and they hadn't seen them in 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah,
Well, it's a
quick story. Procol
Yeah.
Harum recorded with their big album with the Edmonton Symphony. Lighthouse did it first, and Gary Brooker called them when they were in England and said, "You guys played with the symphony," and they said, "Go to Edmonton, Canada. Those guys are fantastic."
Oh, wow. Well, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, you were part of one of the greatest bands Canada has ever produced, Lighthouse. You got to love them. Still love their music. It's second to none, top rate. And you were part of the band. Skip was a Londoner. It's great to say that Lighthouse had London connections. Thanks for being with us here today, Doug. And we'll talk to you soon. Have a good day and stay tuned for more London Lights episodes.
Thanks, Dan. Pleasure being here.